first president of the United States, George Washington, served as president from 1789 to 1797, Federalist from the state of Virginia, elected at the age of 57. Growing up, my school teachers made Washington to be almost like a superhero. I remember being a kid and hearing the story about George Washington and the cherry tree. You know, the one where he cut down the tree. When his father asked him about it, he admits to cutting it down. His father was so proud of his honesty that he didn't punish George. He's made to be infallible. But is this true? Let's find out. Background: Washington came from a family of wealthy tobacco farmers. He was commander in chief of the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War, and prior to becoming president, he was elected president of the Constitutional Convention. The first election took place December 15, 1788 to January 10, 1789. There weren't any political parties at that time. It was just Federalists and non-Federalists. The non-Federalists eventually turned into the Democratic Republican Party, led by Thomas Jefferson. Federalists meant in favor of ratification of the Constitution. Electors will vote for two candidates, and the top two vote getters will be elected president and vice president. George Washington was running unopposed, so the real election was for vice president. John Adams ended up finishing second behind George Washington, thus becoming the nation's first vice president. The second election was held in 1792. Washington also received 100% of the electoral vote. During this time, voting was very restrictive. It was no popular vote, and you had to be a white male of wealth in order to vote. Now, let's get into the good, so-so, and the downright terrible. Let's start with the good. Along with Hamilton as his Treasury Secretary, they built the first model of a national banking system. They took on the war debt of the original 13 states, stayed neutral during France and Britain war. Always believed you should avoid unnecessary war. That way you avoid unnecessary pain and unnecessary death. He only served 2 terms, setting a tradition going forward. The Bill of Rights was ratified during his administration. The Bill of Rights offered the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. As you will see later in this series, the Constitution drastically needed to be amended. Now, let's go on to the so-so, the Whiskey Rebellion. It was a federal tax on liquor that was a catalyst for Pennsylvania farmers to rebel against the federal government. Washington led an army of 12 to 13,000 men and squashed the resistance. Some argue that was an overuse of force. However, Washington was in charge of a newly formed federal government that needed to show that it has some type of authority. Also in the so-so is Native American relations. Washington believed that Native Americans needed to assimilate into white culture or they was going to become extinct. He wanted all Native American relations to be ran through the federal government. However, the states rebelled against this and violated several federal treaties that were negotiated by his administration. Now, it's time to talk about the downright terrible. Washington signed the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. This law authorized local governments to seize and return escapees to their owners and impose penalties on anyone who aided in their fight. The law also imposed a $500 penalty on any person who helped harbor or conceal escapees. And remember, $500 was a lot of money at that time. So you might remember the movie 12 Years a Slave. It was about a freeborn black man being illegally captured and put into slavery. This was a real event, and this happened all the time due to the Fugitive Slave Act. It is one of the worst laws ever passed in this country. Washington also personally owned slaves. He held 123 enslaved Africans, plus another 153 dour slaves. Dour slaves basically just means it was inherited through his marriage. There's been a debate about how Washington treated these enslaved Africans. Some reports say he treated them better than others. Others say it was worse. But this is a silly discussion. The institution itself is so barbaric, so inhumane. It's of little consequence if he quote unquote treated them better. But we do know that Washington often sold slaves to buyers in the West Indies, ensuring families would never see each other again. This was used as a form of punishment along with harsh whippings and work assignments. George Washington did write in his will, however, to free these enslaved Africans after the death of his wife. But by law, George and his wife could not free the dower slaves, and they was passed on to their grandchildren. George Washington's grandchildren did not share George's newly found belief that these enslaved Africans should be set free. During his presidency, George Washington made no official public statement about slavery or emancipation. So regardless of Washington's personal feelings about slavery towards the end of his life, he never did anything to challenge the institution while he had the power. In fact, he strengthened the institution of slavery by signing that 1793 Fugitive Slave Act. Too often, the atrocities of slavery and the treatment and policies directed at black people get overlooked as nothing more than a footnote. It doesn't fit in with American exceptionalism that the history books like to present. People give Washington and others a pass even though they supported such inhumane policy. It is just chalked up to being part of the times. But there were other people in this very same time period that understood how barbaric, how cruel the institution and the policies that surrounded slavery were. Thomas Paine is an example of such a person. We can acknowledge people like Washington's successes and simultaneously point out their miserable failures when it comes to human rights. Up next, the second president of the United States, John Adams. This is Amin Shah, signing off. Peace.